More often than not, I am inspired by the conversations I share in this space. But sometimes the words of my guests speak directly to my knowing in ways that feel both scary and empowering. This episode is absolutely one of those times. Hey, y'all. If we haven't met yet, I'm Sarah, your host at What's on Your Plate podcast, and I'm so glad you're here. I had the pleasure of speaking with Louise Cridland recently about unconventional paths. Louise is a holistic psychologist who found her way to this path by choosing to go outside of the standardized systems, by releasing herself from the pressures to conform, and by learning to listen to her heart's voice instead of her head's voice. This one is deep and so relatable and necessary. Let's just jump right in. Awesome. Well, I'm really excited to get this conversation going today because it's talking about looking at things from a different lens, kind of an untraditional way of finding happiness from within. I'm here today with Louise Cridland. She's a holistic psychologist. And while that is quite multi-layered, that's a lot to unpack. Today in our conversation, we're going to be talking about those unconventional paths and going beyond and maybe outside of what is expected of us. I'm so excited to have you here today.
Thanks, Sarah. Really good to be here.
So let's start to pick this apart a little bit. This is definitely something that probably should be a series of episodes because there's just so much to say. But
Yeah.
let's start by just hearing about you and your journey into this type of work.
Mm. Well, if I look back and look back at the different experiences of my life, I can picture very clearly being about 6. I was in, those sitting on this tiny little chair that was at a tiny desk. I don't know if you had that sort of thing in your early childhood classes, what you'd find in a childhood education classroom. And I was coloring in, and I had all my little friends around me coloring in. And I vividly remember we had this relief teacher called Mr. Marks, and he was known to be really intimidating, angry, and scary. And he came behind me and he towered over me and he took one look at what I had colored in and he said, "You've just wasted that piece of paper." And I
Wow.
remember being frozen for one, but the shame that I felt in my little body and the sinking feeling in my body that what I did was not enough and I can't do this. And later on, it became this story of I'm not creative, I'm different. I didn't fit his brief. And that really was one of those pivotal moments that then was added to a few more where I was told that if I didn't focus on one activity, say a sport at that particular time, I'd never excel at anything. Later, I got another boss telling me that if I didn't want to go into senior management, then I would only end up a good psychologist. And if I add all these experiences together and the systems that we find ourselves in, whether it's school or universities or professions, there was such a pressure to conform, and being multifaceted was not considered a gift in their mind. And it was only later that I started to realize that actually having multiple facets and multiple passions was actually one of my gifts. And so,
Absolutely.
and so this started this path of, and it followed me into my professional career, being a psychologist, which is quite a conservative profession. And I found myself talking, teaching, and working with clients in a certain way that I thought that, well, I focused on anxiety because I'd lived it. And I thought, well, that's something that is accepted in the psychology world. And it wasn't really until I was about to turn 30 or just turned 30 and I was sitting in my childhood room again, and I was looking around at all my things, and I just had a significant relationship breakdown. And I realized that my clinical psychology training the sessions that I'd had with a clinical psychologist was not going to cut it, and that I needed to do something different. And so that began the journey into holistic practices and holistic psychology.
Thank you for giving us that glimpse into just how it started for you. And I can absolutely relate to that little girl that you were sitting there feeling just like you were not good enough or that you lacked something that seemingly the other kids around you had. And to be called out on it at that. And no doubt that memory is strong for you. Probably something that was an important part of needing to happen, I guess, to get to where you are today. You know, we can look back on things like that in hindsight and almost be thankful for those situations, almost, right? Not quite, but
Yeah.
um, you know, we don't have to go through such hard things to get the point in life sometimes, right?
Yeah.
But I'm glad that it just inspired you to along the way, as you kept finding things that didn't feel good to you in the way of traditional or conventional types of things, to look elsewhere and outside of what is standard and what is common to reach for something different.
Yes, and I felt like my hand was forced, although it was a choice. But I don't know if you've heard this idea of the universe will send you whispers, and if you don't listen, you then get a crisis.
Hmm.
And that's certainly what happened to me. And I am grateful for that period, as dark and as difficult as it was. And um, what's really important and what I've learned, and which is a big part of my work now, is trying to shift from our heads, purely focused on our heads, purely focused on goal setting, purely focused on just thinking and rational thought. And can we start to shift into listening and making space for our intuition to arise and listening to our heart? Because when we don't, we find that, well, I found, and I know my clients often find, you end up in a situation where you feel hollow. And all these things that you thought you were meant to be doing or should be doing, or what you thought maybe even success was, is not, and it's not fulfilling. And so that hollow sense, if anyone's struggling with that right now, I really encourage anyone listening to start to go towards that, because we're really good at running the other way and filling up with all sorts of different things to try and avoid really facing it.
Yeah, we sure are. Everything from something as simple as maybe bad habits to addictions to um, just finding ourselves in places that aren't for us, right? All of a way to avoid what is trying to be whispered.
Mm,
The universe whispering to us and soon to be shouting, so we can hear better or at least pay better attention. Louise,
yeah.
can you tell us um, what some of those whispers were for you? What along your path did, in hindsight, you see or that were presented to you, but you
Mm.
either were not willing to see them or hadn't put the connection to them yet?
Such a good question. A whisper, and I don't think it was a whisper, but it felt stronger than a whisper, but it wasn't a crisis. So it was this sense of when I used to go into an office every day and commute on the train and the bus to get there, and being in an office environment in the bright lights, being inside all day, that just felt wrong. It didn't feel right. And I could feel that in my body, whether it was on a Sunday or a Monday, in the lead up, on the way there. And the work I was doing, I actually quite enjoyed, but it was still this sense of there's something not quite right here. So I really felt like that was a whisper. I just knew deep down I wasn't born to work in an office my whole life. And then more recently with my career, I noticed when I was specializing in anxiety and the way I would talk about it to people, I wasn't excited. I'd I'd be, oh yes, I'm a psychologist and I work with people who struggle with anxiety. And important a job that is, it wasn't my purpose. It wasn't what my soul was calling me to do. So I noticed it in the way that I would speak about my work to people. And you can feel it. Does it light your face up? Or do you feel like you're just almost saying it as a aside that, well, this is what I do? So that was another whisper.
So things like dread and indifference to what you're doing, those are things that we should be paying attention to, just
Yes.
not thinking that you just have to walk through the mundane of your day. That's not normal, right? It might be normal, but it doesn't mean it's right.
Yes. And what I think society is getting better these days, but particularly in office environments, rational thinking and thought is very much given the importance and significance over listening to your emotions. And I know we're getting better as a society, but what you were saying there about the indifference and the dread, those are messages. Those are your emotions telling you something really clearly. And we have to listen to those just as much as we listen to the 80,000 thoughts that we have each day. So I talk to people about emotions. They're your tools. They are information.
Right. Yeah, that's so important to remember that they are information. They're like little memos that are being sent constantly.
Yeah.
Um, and we keep missing those memos. Tell us about the difference between listening to the intuition of what your knowing is versus listening to the fears. Because I think that a lot of times those two things can get confused for the other.
Mm. And if you're highly stressed and you don't make much time for yourself and you're a lot in that fight or flight freeze response, then it's really hard to actually discern what is fear and what is my intuition.
Mhm.
And so that's a really important point. And when I was really struggling with anxiety in my younger years, I don't think I could hear my intuition that well because I was completely consumed by anxious thoughts. However, that's when it's really important to start to see and listen and make room for your emotions. That is the foundation, I believe, to getting closer to your intuition and to getting to know whether is this fear, is this conditioning, is this someone else's belief, is this a belief I've absorbed from society, or is this actually something that I believe and I have a deep desire about and it just feels wrong.
Right. Is that's similar or is it the same of what you speak on when you talk about your head voice versus your heart voice?
Similar. It's a great way to start to strengthen your intuition, to just simplify this idea of you've got this head voice that's usually fear-based, anxious, limited, not all the time. And then you've got this heart voice that it's that. So, for example, you might listen to an incredible podcast. I just had a friend talk to me about she listened to Chris Martin's podcast recently, and she just felt like she wanted to give it all away and start again in her career. And when she said that to me, I said, that is your heart voice talking. When we get moved and we have this emotional reaction to a story, to a song, to a podcast, to an artwork, that is when you can start to get in touch with that heart voice that's driven by your desire and your longing.
I love the way that you described that. That's maybe the most clear I've ever heard it described in terms of listening to your heart. as a way of something that moves you or brings up emotion, and then you know it's different from just feeling afraid.
Yes. And then the important next step is listen to when your head voice will come in and say, well, how can you leave your job? How can you start something else? How is it going to happen? And that's when you can start to hear how your heart, your head voice starts to try and complicate things, and it needs to try and it needs to control every step. But learning to live by your heart, you have to start with, okay, I really felt something there. I'm not saying tomorrow go and quit your job, but take some time. Take some time to reflect on what you felt. And don't discount those really radical ideas of, I want to throw it all away. Because it's usually our heart voice isn't leading us down the easiest path. And that's why a lot of people don't follow it. It's
It's
often not the
tragic
easiest.
too.
Mm.
Right. Yeah, it's really tragic to think about not listening to your heart voice. I mean, ultimately that is, I would think, translated into your passions and even your life purpose of what you're even here to do. So to dismiss it, and I think we've all been guilty of that somewhere along the way. It's just how loud does the universe have to be in order to get our attention and put us into sometimes that crisis mode that you've talked about. Sometimes that's what it takes.
Yes, I was just reading about this the other day that sometimes we have to have these crises in order to break down our need to be in that comfort zone and our psychological defenses that just keep us small and keep us just focused on day to day and surviving. And sometimes we need these shakeups to go, actually, I can't continue this way. I have to choose another path. And you mentioned purpose. And what I think a lot of people forget or don't realize is that a lot of people are focused on the long-term purpose, finding your long-term life purpose. But your daily purpose is just as important. And it's actually getting you to your longer term purpose.
I love that you said that because absolutely we get wrapped up in the big thing, right? Like the thing that we think has to be epic and large and just consuming of everything, but those little bits and pieces every day that make up the big thing, if we don't spend time on those things, if we don't show up for those small bite-sized purposes, I don't know that we'll ever get to the larger purpose in our lives. I think that we would just become so discouraged. It's like the meme I've seen before of two side by side ladders, and one of them is a typical ladder where you're taking um, manageable steps up, 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 and up. And then there's the one next to it where the steps are like, 10 feet apart, and you're trying to just leap towards the one that is far away, but you can't quite reach it. But it's because you haven't utilized the steps that come before that one.
Mm. Yes, and that relates to what we're talking about in this daily and then longer term purpose. And if we're always living in the future, we're really not living present day to day. And to get your heart voice louder, you've got to look after your body in a way that you love. You've got to practice certain things on a daily basis as your purpose. And for me, my daily purpose is, how can I feel most alive today? What does that look like? And that doesn't look like overworking. That looks like a lot of things that make up me and my family and what's important. And then I feel like I'm living my daily purpose.
Yes, absolutely. And I love how you bring into the conversation connection with not just your body, but with nature and the acknowledgement of how they're the same, really.
Mm. 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 I used to if I needed to make a decision, I mean, I'm hands up, overthinker, have been an overthinker for as long as I can remember. I can now see the gift in that, but yeah, I did love to overthink and be in my head. And so when I used to make a decision, I'd get the pros and cons list out, and that would make me even more confused. I would go over and over the decision I have to make. I would talk to so many different people, get everyone else's opinions. And it would really make me sick thinking about if I had to make a big decision. And I didn't have that clarity. And now it's so different. So, one, I mean, working through anxiety, I actually learned to surrender to whatever you're feeling and to trust wherever you are right now. And so when I'm now making a decision, I actually set an intention to, it might be to get clarity on the next step. It could be something really specific about, do I work with this person in a few months' time, or whatever it might be? Do I take on this new project? And then I listen, and I go outside, and I go for my walks, and I go for the swimming that I love to do, and I start to listen, and I listen to how I feel in nature. And often we are most creative when we're walking, when we're outside. If you look at all the creative geniuses and how they talk about creativity, it's often in nature. It's not sitting at a desk or trying to force an idea. And you can use this in decision making as well. I also do it before I go to bed. I set the intention of, I have quite vivid dreams. So often something will come to me while I'm sleeping. So I set the intention to gain some clarity or guidance at nighttime. Sometimes it comes and sometimes it doesn't. But the important thing is waiting, if you can, being patient, but letting go that the mind has to make the decision. And that's been a huge turning point in my life, because I now know I can trust my intuition, and I can trust my desires and my yearnings, and let that help me make those decisions instead of just forcing it with my mind.
I keep thinking about the little girl that you were sitting at the desk, coloring something that wasn't to the standard of the adults in the room. And that squashing of your creativity, being forced to just sit there and conform to what somebody else's idea of creation was. I'm just sitting here thinking about, I'm thankful you found it again. And I'm thankful that you found your way to yourself and knowing that that was never your truth.
Mm. Thank you. And that's really beautiful for you to recognize and to see me in that way. And the sad thing is, but also I urge people to take it as an empowering message, that I got that message again in high school English. I loved creative writing. I could do that till I was asleep at the desk in the exam room. But give me a text and I had to write it in a structured way, and I wasn't very good. So I came out of school thinking I couldn't write, I wasn't creative, and I wasn't good at English. And the systems that we find ourselves in do not often reflect our genius and our gifts. And so I want anyone listening, if they've got any sort of similar experience, to know that you've got to follow that burning desire. So for example, as a kid, I would write my dreams out. I would just love to write. But it was a natural thing I just loved to do. But until I got told that I wasn't good at it, I thought, okay, I can't really pursue this. And so we will always get told certain things. And that is when the heart voice is so important, because if you have that desire and you love to do something, that is all you need. You don't need that external validation that you're good enough to pursue it in whatever way you want to.
Such a beautiful way of thinking. I love this conversation so much. It really has me just reflecting on the way that we educate children and how if we really change that in a very radical way to allow for those creative ideas to flow that bubble up inside of the children, inside of us, versus being told what we should be creating, allowing our own lights and passions to guide the way that we learn and what we develop and create as adults. And there's some of that happening in the world, but if we could do it on a bigger scale, I think so much of your pain would have been avoided over the
Mm.
years.
And mental
But
health issues. I,
mhm.
I, I really see that a mental health, anxiety, depression, again, it's a message that you are not living aligned to what you're meant to be doing. And that's not through fault of yours, but our mental health issues in society are messages around that something's not quite right here. And often it can be because you are following a job or profession that you thought you should because you got told in year 10 that that would be suitable for your capabilities, whatever, or your parents, or whatever it might be. And then we find that we're anxious and we're depressed and we're hollow. So
Yeah.
yes, yeah.
What you say about depression and anxiety, I think about the way I've heard people say how depression runs in my family, or anxiety is something that everybody has in my family. And I think that is more of a generational trauma response and trauma um, indication, whether it's a big T or little t, right? But I think that's more generational healing that needs to happen more so than it is something that is hereditary. Would you
Mm.
give me your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and it sounds, without talking about anyone specifically, but
Hmm.
it sounds like it becomes their narrative, just like it became my narrative that I wasn't creative or I wasn't good enough or I wasn't good at that. We absorb so much as little people when we're growing up, and if we're absorbing from our parents that there's anxiety and there's a lot of fear in the world, that is going to become our experience and it's going to become our narrative. And it's going to happen before you even realize it's a choice. So it doesn't feel like a choice. It just feels like that is what life is like. And one of the most important things that helped me when I was going through all my process and healing and seeing all sorts of incredible healers was realizing that some of this stuff, this anxiety, it wasn't mine. And I can choose to let some of that go. And I can choose to start to focus on the things that do light me up, or choose to focus on that I can trust. I can trust in the world, even in the face of intense fear.
Right. Even just that word or the way we identify with something like anxiety, saying my anxiety, like you're owning it
Mm,
versus just saying the anxiety, or using some other verbiage to not tie it to who you are or claim it as something that is yours, something
mm,
that you don't want to keep. I feel
yeah.
should be spoken about a bit differently.
Mm. But for my experience, when I was really struggling, I was struggling with panic attacks and anxiety, and I found that when I could normalize that I was experiencing this intense anxiety for whatever reason, that it was actually a normal response of my body. It was just happening too frequently.
Mhm.
And so it really helped me to understand that there was nothing wrong with the anxiety. And actually it's a gift into what's underneath that. There's an incredible book called The Wisdom of Anxiety. And she talks about this idea that sounds a bit complicated and counterintuitive, but this idea about anxiety is secondary. Usually, and from my experience with clients, usually there's a lot of grief that actually sits underneath the anxiety. And it's the brain's way of trying to keep you in your head and in your thinking, even if you're feeling anxiety in your body, to prevent you going deeper, to really understanding what's underneath the anxiety. And usually there is unexpressed grief, grief you've been running from, anger that you didn't want to feel and you keep pushing down. Often I find anxiety is the bubble up, and particularly panic attacks, it's the bubble up of all the emotions you've been stuffing down for so many years.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your perspective on that. That really makes a lot of sense, and I really love what you shared in all of that. How did you start to reel in or redefine yourself in terms of that anxious energy that you had? What are some of the tools you use to get that under control or surrender to the emotions like you talked about earlier? What are
Mm.
some of the things that helped you?
Yeah. And I love how you said surrender. And that is the key to anxiety. And it's what no one wants to hear with anxiety, because that feels the most terrifying thing to do. Uh, the number one tool that really got me through and transformed my life and still to today is silence and being able to sit and be with myself and allow myself to feel all the sorts of things that I didn't want to feel. I used to be terrified to be on my own, and I would fill up my life with any activity, any course, any anything related to my career, so I didn't have to be with myself. And often people say, oh, it's really boring, or I just can't do it. And I couldn't do it either. But if you want to overcome some of the habits that you feel like are really holding you back, or you are struggling with anxiety, starting to learn to be with yourself is really the first step. And this isn't, sometimes you can't, if you're really anxious, you can't just sit and meditate on your own in silence. That's probably not going to work for you. And how I started is I started listening to binaural beats. Have you heard of binaural beats?
I think so. Tell me what it is.
It sounds a bit crazy, but it's on a lot of the meditation apps these days, and so you can actually search for it. And it's certain sounds, frequencies that allow you to get into a meditative state, and you don't have to do anything. You don't have to focus on the breath. You don't have to focus on trying to quieten your mind. And I love that because I knew I could just sit, I could listen to the sounds,
Mhm.
and then get into this calmer state. And then the more I did that, so that I got out of that really activated state, the more I could actually start to sit 5 minutes on my own, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, to then going to silent meditation retreats. But not everyone has to do that. But starting to sit and be reflective, even journaling if meditation feels like it's too far. But I had to start to face that there were parts of me that I really didn't like. And all of that bubbled to the surface when I used to be by myself. And it's only through starting to face those things and to surrender to whatever emotion, whatever situation I found myself in, was I able then to get clarity. I learned, like, silence for me taught me how to sit with the uncomfortable. And if you can learn that, life becomes so much easier.
As somebody speaking for myself who enjoys solitude and even seeks out quiet by myself type of time, and maybe you answered it a little bit already, but my question is, what is it that people are afraid of when they find themselves in their own heads or in the quiet of just themselves?
It's their emotions. The emotions that they are swallowing, pushing down, avoiding, numbing, distracting from, all come bubbling up to the surface when you don't have a stimulus to focus on, whether it's a phone or a TV show or a podcast or whatever it might be. It all then bubbles up. So it can be really overwhelming if you haven't been that emotionally in tune, which I certainly wasn't. I was very much just living out of my head day in and day out, and that it can be really overwhelming when that does start to bubble up. But another thing that really changed my life was that it was okay to feel. It was okay to feel sadness or anger or anxiety, that it was okay. And when I realized that it was okay, then I could then start to sit with, okay, these emotions are really hard, but when you break them down, they are sensations, moving sensations in your body. Could be in your chest, could be in your forehead, your throat, your tummy, anywhere. And when you can just purely focus on the physical sensation and breathe and make room, then they magically transform. They change into something else. And so then you start to learn this deep wisdom about life and about your emotions, that nothing stays the same. It's constantly changing.
Right. And I think that that can be both comforting and scary to people at the same time.
Totally. Totally. Yes. Yes. When you're in the negative, so-called negative emotions, it's helpful. But when you're really connected and loving life, you want to grasp. And that was what was really great about when I was studying Buddhism. It was really learning to loosen my grasp on any state, any emotion that I found myself in. Because it's this grasping, it's this wanting things to stay the same that's actually causing us distress and more anxiety.
Mhm. So, getting back to how I started this conversation of talking about unconventional paths to go beyond what is expected, what does that look like for you in terms of how other people expect you to show up?
Mm. The pressure I felt,
Right.
or yeah. Well, if I look at professionally, this pressure I felt to, I think I said before, work in a certain way, teach on things in a certain way, and what I found in my practice, in my private practice with clients and my coaching, that is that I wasn't helping them the way that I wanted to, because I felt I couldn't bring in, say, spiritual elements or learning to trust in the universe and these sorts of phrases. I felt like I had to stay in the box of traditional psychology. And I started to feel really inauthentic. And I started to feel like I actually wasn't helping them. And it felt wrong to me. And so I sensed a pressure to be like my peers in psychology, to be like my profession. And no one said anything. It was this internalized pressure. And sure, people probably think and they judge, and we can't control that. But coming back to this heart voice idea, if we don't listen to the knowing that, hey, this just doesn't feel good anymore. There's something not quite right about how I'm working. Like my soul, I feel limited. And starting to bring in the way I work with people, because it hugely helped me. And I knew some people weren't like that, and that's okay. They'll find someone that's suited to them. But then I can really help the people that are aligned with how I see the world and what's hugely transformed me. And that's bringing in spirituality at times. It's bringing in this connection to nature, connection to the universe, so that we're not alone. We've got an ally, and for nature, for me, is my ally. So I don't know if I just answered your question, but it was moving towards, how do I really want to spend my time with people and be true to really what I believe and what I love and why I'm here, and start to speak about that openly.
Mhm. So let's talk about the way that you help other people. Let's talk about how you help people start listening to those heart voices versus the head voices, and how we even start to know how to do that, right? After so much programming of just being told to stay in the lane of the path to where we're expected to be. How do
Yeah.
we even know how to find ourselves? How do you start with clients like that?
And it's really challenging. I find a lot of clients come to me and don't know what their dreams are or how to dream. And often they don't even realize that they don't let themselves dream. And the experience I've shared really did, I've noticed how I stopped dreaming along the way. I stopped having these wonderful, radical, unrealistic dreams about what I could do for work and how I wanted my life to work out. So part of this is, and the work that I do with people is helping people start to dream again. And to do that, you have to start becoming aware of how you're actually limiting yourself. So I'd ask people, where are they settling? Where are you settling in your life? Is it in your relationship that you don't want to face? Is it in a career that's not fulfilling? Is it the way you talk about yourself when you're around other people? You know, where is that settling energy playing out for you? And that's a really good indication that you've been following your head and not your heart. So there's some questions I ask them. But coming back to the foundation of your daily purpose, if you're not looking after your body, the vessel of your intuition and your purpose, then it gets really hard to get clarity. So it's finding a way. I never prescribe a certain daily practice for people, because I really find people have to find what works best for them. Certainly, I've got lots of ideas, but it's finding what's your bliss? How do you create that bliss on a daily basis? And then how can you more often tap into that different sense of, whether it's awe, or when we're talking about that podcast, that feeling moved. How often are you experiencing those sorts of emotions day to day?
Yeah, that's definitely a lot to think about. And I can understand why it's hard for people to work past those limiting beliefs of that head voice when you're asking people to um, define where they're settling at in life. That's a hard question, and it's one that takes a ton of vulnerability and transparency, even within themselves, even if they don't say it out loud, right? And scary as that question is, I think it's so important. And even just initial thoughts, reflecting on that in this moment, in this conversation with you, it feels so just awakening. It's such a important question. And I just, I love that you're asking that, because it just feels so right and so intentional.
Mm. And I love that you've used that word, because this has been another big change in my life. Back, I don't know, 15 years ago, I was very much just busy all the time. And what's the next thing I can achieve? And then the next thing, and how can I keep myself even busier? There was uh, there was goal setting, but that's very different to intention and setting
Mm,
intentions.
yeah,
And the way that you responded just then, it's like this intention comes from your heart. It's like,
right.
why am I here? What sort of relationships do I want to have on this earth? How do I want to spend my time?
And I think in the societies that we live in today, living intentionally and asking ourselves how we want to spend our time and what is fulfillment, those things get very much blurred with a producing state of mind, a achievement, a goal type of mentality, that we always need to be doing more, right? There's like badges of honor for resting less. And it really, when you really stop and ask yourself like those hard questions you're asking people about just the connectiveness to themselves and to nature and the clarity that comes from silence. Um, I think if we really sit with that, we really start to be able to separate those mentalities of, again, as you said, why are we here?
Mhm. Yeah, and I think you've pointed to this is a layered approach, and there's multiple parts to this. And I also want to recognize what you said there around this can be so terrifying and scary, and there's a reason we're not confronting these things. There's a reason why we're avoiding them, because they're hard and it's really painful. And if I take myself back to that moment in my childhood room, I realized that I was not somewhere that I had dreamed I would be, that I was living a life that I didn't think was planned for me. I'd made a lot of mistakes and I'd lost friendships and partnerships and all sorts of things. And it's really painful to confront those things. But if we don't, we will never create meaning and real fulfillment in our life.
And I think the willingness to step back from those relationships or friendships or places of employment, um, the willingness to lose those things, right, in order to not lose ourselves is something that really needs to be understood, where we're settling or what we're allowing in exchange for our own happiness. I think it's
Yes.
important to be really honest about that with ourselves.
And there's always choice. And I think anyone might be listening, they might even have some ideas about how they would want to change their life, but then the pressure of money, time, certain responsibilities, then it's like the mind comes in and go again, this how question. Well, how does that even happen? And coming back to that meme you were talking about with the ladder, it's like that. The mind is trying to jump forward to a completely different life when it's a process and it's a path towards greater happiness and fulfillment, but it's a process of setting that intention, asking some of those hard questions, and then just taking one step at a time. And often it also means speaking to someone. It can be really hard to do this on your own.
For sure. And that latter meme reminds me of just the way that we always create problems that don't exist. You know, we manifest these thoughts in our minds about the worst case scenario and the what if this, and
Mm,
just all these things that we create in our minds that are just us completely trying to get in our way.
yeah, and if you look at the brain and you look at what's underneath what you've just said there, is that our brains are really great for keeping us safe, keeping us in our comfort zones, playing small, staying limited, because that's safe. You know, I'm not going to break away from the pack, because then I'm still connected. But if I do something different, then I may not be in that pack anymore. And so we have to also have the awareness of, oh, okay, that's my brain trying to limit myself. That's my brain actually being scared of success or making some changes. And that plays into this. What are the problems, the obstacles that we're creating from our mind?
Yeah. It makes so much sense, everything that you've been sharing. And It is something for sure that I think if everybody sits with this conversation and is honest with themselves, they will be really unpacking a lot for themselves. These difficult questions and the way that we listen to our heart rather than our mind is something that we're not really told to do, right? In the world that we live in, be practical, be logical,
Mm.
step away from what it is you want and to go into the direction of what is needed or what you're told is needed. So it's a reprogramming of ourselves to find who we are essentially again.
Yeah. And starting to learn how your intuition speaks to you. And as you said that and talked about being logical, and my partner's very logical. And so whenever I would have these intuitive hits about something, whether a decision or something to do, and I would talk about it, I couldn't describe logically how I got to that explanation or that point or that insight. And it's taken me years to trust and have belief that that intuition is truth to me. It doesn't have to be logical to other people. And so it's starting to learn to listen and figure out how your intuition speaks to you. For some people, it's images, it's a knowing, it's a sense, it's a feeling. So it can be really, really different for different people.
I love that you said it doesn't have to make sense to other people. That I think is something
That's a
everybody
big
needs
one.
to hear. Yeah, it is a big one. And that we don't need the validation outside of ourselves to walk the path that is ours. I think it's just really important to remind ourselves of that all the time.
Yes. Yes. And coming back to that, that our brain wants to be connected in a tribe. That it's meant to do that. So sometimes we have to overwrite that fear-based reaction to it's okay to be different. It's okay that this doesn't make sense to other people. So it can feel hard at first because you are essentially overriding your fear response of your brain, which is the strongest response in your body to keep you safe.
Mm. It's just been such a beautiful conversation. There's just been so many eye-opening moments for me, for sure. Louise, tell us, if you can, about what it looks like to work with somebody like you, somebody who wanted to dig deeper into this. How do you help them and what can they expect?
Mhm. Well, it's different for different people. Again, I don't have a one size fits all approach because that's just not possible for the beautiful humans that I come across. But a foundation is how we can look at what you're doing daily on a daily basis in terms of your habits and setting that really strong foundation so you can start to strengthen your intuition. So that's a big part. And then it's also starting to unpack some of those hard questions I was asking around settling. Where are you losing your energy? Where are you losing your power in the way that you speak, in the choice of career or relationship that you're having? So we start to unpack and filter through every aspect of their life. And by asking the right questions, my beautiful clients come to their own answers. They start to get clarity around some of these things that may not have been so clear before. And so we just keep honing this process of, and talking about really small moments like that podcast example. So I can start to help people identify, okay, that is my head voice and that's my heart voice. So that's a big part. And then once we can start listening to our hearts, life becomes clearer and simpler, not always easier, but it becomes much more exciting. And then they start to really figure out what their purpose is, what they want to do for work, and they start to dream again.
That's beautiful. I love that. And I love that you talk about them finding their own answers. Like the answers that we seek are always within ourselves, right? We just might need some help finding them and redirecting ourselves back.
Totally. And another thing, as trained as a psychologist, you were trained that you were providing a service. And I did some training, it's called Gestalt therapy, and it is incredible. And I very much learned that you are sitting alongside your client. You aren't the expert. And that just got me so deep within. It never felt right that I was sitting across from someone providing a service, being an expert. Because I've studied Buddhism, I've studied yoga, I've worked with an initiated shaman, I've done all these different things, and everything just brings me back to my own wisdom. And if I can help people find their own wisdom, that I can't really imagine a better job than that. I can't even say it's a job, but it's an incredible gift to work with people and walk alongside their journey of finding their own wisdom again.
I think that's everything right there, what you said. Tell us how people can find you outside of this conversation.
You can go to my website, which is www.louisecridland.com. You can find me on Instagram, on LinkedIn. They're the places I tend to be. I also don't tend to be online a huge amount because it does go against my philosophy and it gets me into my head, to be honest. But I love to share practical things on Instagram around these small moments day to day, because really finding and strengthening your intuition starts with these tiny moments throughout your day.
Mm-hmm.
So they're the things I love to share with people.
I love that so much. Is there anything as we come to a close of this conversation today? I can't even believe it's been like an hour that we've been sitting here talking.
Yeah.
It's just been so good. But tell me what you would like to leave our listeners with today.
What's one thing that you could reflect on or that you could do that would honor this body, this vessel that you've been given?
That's so perfect.
And start there.
I love that so much. Thank you so much for being here today. This has been absolutely wonderful.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's been such a beautiful conversation and all such amazing questions, and I've loved being here.
Where are you settling in life? What are you allowing in place of happiness? This episode is full of questions and ways to self-reflect in a way that prompts us to be really honest with ourselves. Admittedly, that can feel really scary. I'm so thankful for this conversation. One of the biggest takeaways for me was, if you don't confront the things that feel hard, you will never create meaning or real fulfillment in life. Every time you want to avoid something, I hope that you come back to that quote from Louise. I know I will. Continue to stay in touch with her and be inspired by her by clicking on the links in the show notes. I'd also appreciate you taking a moment to subscribe to this podcast. It only takes a second to click that little follow or plus button, but it makes a huge difference to keeping these conversations coming. Please also share this episode with a friend. If you felt inspired and were informed by it, someone else will too. Until next time, friends.